Fred Craddock tells of an occasion he had visiting two 16-year-old girls. Fred Craddock is a pastor in our denomination. The first came down the large spiral staircase of her parents' mansion. Beautiful blue dress, sparkling face, all ready to graduate from high school and on to Yale in the fall. The second girl Fred went to visit after she had had a baby. She was standing on the porch of her parents' rural Kentucky home, new child in her arms, father long gone, and she had recently dropped out of high school. What's the difference between those two pretty girls? In his prayers that evening, Fred asked that question of God. God, did you notice the difference between those girls? One with a bright future, the other without much hope. And God said, no, I didn't notice the difference. Fred thought to himself, oh, God must be getting old, losing eyesight, getting a little senile. Come on, anybody can see the difference, except God. The Lord does not look at the things people look at, God says to Samuel in this week's lesson. People look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, each of them with more kingly potential than the previous. But God chooses none of them. Are these all the sons you have, Jesse? There's one more. Jesse tells Samuel, David, his 8th son, is the runt of the litter. Certainly handsome according to the Bible, but not one you look at and say, there's a king. But David is the one God has chosen. By now, of course, we know that God has warmed up to the idea of the Israelites having an earthly king. God will share some of the responsibilities of leadership with that earthly representative. The most important factor will have nothing to do with his height, his build, or his outward appearance, but instead, God will focus on what matters most with this next king, his heart. David was a man after God's own heart. So how is that heart revealed? What did God see in David? Well, David is fully engaged in caring for and tending his sheep. David protects his sheep from great danger and at great risk to himself, fights a lion, fights a bear on 2 different occasions with his bare hands. It is often said that how one treats animals is the best indication of one's character. How one cares for those who are innocent and helpless, in other words. If David goes to such lengths to protect his sheep from harm, how much more would he be able to guide and to protect God's people? God, the great shepherd, sees a fine representative of his own nature among the sons of Jesse. Now, from our lower story perspective, David doesn't have a shot, really. He's not even called by Jesse when asked to present his sons. King Saul looks at David and sees a mere boy. Indeed, David is only 16 years old at this point. 16 years old. And when David bravely volunteers to fight that intimidating giant named Goliath, the giant essentially calls him a stick, right? From our vantage point, David hasn't got much. But from God's vantage point, from the upper story, he is the only shot. Jonathan, Saul's son and the rightful successor to the throne, sees it too. And Jonathan honors David by giving him his royal robe. He helps David see his potential. Sometimes it takes someone else pointing out something in us we either don't see or are unwilling to admit. We all need a Jonathan in our lives, I think, a true friend who is willing to look on our hearts and the very best of what God has placed within each of us and to point to it and to say it aloud to us. Who in our lives needs us to see them like Jonathan saw David? Your simple word of encouragement might set someone on a journey they never imagined. I wonder, would you, with me this week, look for an opportunity to share with someone the great gifts you see in them? So, before David knows it, this horn of oil is poured on his head. He becomes God's anointed one. In Hebrew, the word is Mashiach, the Messiah. But this 16-year-old does not immediately take the throne. He'll go through 14 years of training before becoming king. And that training mostly will be in his character and who he is and will become. King Saul, who has spun even further out of control since last week, if you recall, actually tries to kill David in a jealous rage. But when David has the opportunity to make an assassination attempt on Saul, David instead shows him mercy. David becomes this fugitive, really, and spends 14 years in training, learning to depend on God and God's provision alone. And in return, David wrote some of the most beautiful praise poems to God ever written. Finally, at age 30, he is inaugurated king of Israel. God says, "I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I have for him to do." This is the type of person God will use to build a nation. Saul was in, but not all the way. If you remember from last week, Saul kind of withholds some of his allegiance, saves a little bit for himself. And Saul thinks these little issues won't matter. But they do. They matter to God because God has spoken them. Over this Thanksgiving break, I spent a few days at home, and I got to play lots of cards with my extended family. And the name of the game in the Lehman household is euchre. We got any euchre players in the house? By the way, I will play any time if you want to come down to church. We eat it up as fast as our Thanksgiving dinner. We can't get through dinner quick enough so we can start. And that's where the real fun and fellowship begins. Now, while much in this game of euchre is left to chance and how the cards are dealt, of course, there is a timid way of playing and a more aggressive way of playing. As my brother and I sought to beat my cousin and his brother to win best out of 3, our motto became all in. And not just one fist bump, but 2. All in. Let's do this. All in. Committed to taking risks whenever possible to win the game. Almost never works. Typically never works in euchre. Especially does not work with God. As this storybook shows week after week, this grand story that God is sculpting, God desires everyone chosen and called by him off of the benches, off of the sidelines, and onto the field, going all in so that God's purposes can be accomplished in us. It requires great trust that God is indeed God, and that God never leaves us alone to do these tasks. With euchre, all in may be a risk and not always pay off. With God, though, all in is a sure bet, even when it's difficult. It's the transaction God proposes to us that is rewarded with life itself. Not necessarily the easiest life, but the best life. Many Jews still recite daily the all-in declaration referred to as the Shema, which is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." Of such a daunting task, Moses will later say in Deuteronomy his final words to the people before they take the promised land. "What I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, or death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord will bless you. But if your hearts turn away and are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed." Wow. Stark turn. Trusting God, going all in with our loving, is life itself. And this is exactly what David will do. Will he fail and fail big? Absolutely, as as we will find out next week. But he will continually come back to God, continually realign his story to God's story, knowing that he will be met with mercy each time. So, I ask us today, are we up for the challenge of doing the same? Our Lord's stories can sometimes convince us of some pretty harmful lies. Lies like we're not good enough. Lies like we don't have anything to offer. We compare ourselves to others so much that our gifts seem to pale in comparison, and then we are afraid to share them. We let the world tell us what is beautiful and therefore more worthy. But God looks on the heart. Let us never, ever forget that. God cares most about the heart. It's what matters most. Look what God accomplished through a teenager with a heart after God's own. What might God do with each of us? The possibilities are endless. This is the season where we await the Messiah that would come hundreds and hundreds of years after King David. It will be important to remember throughout this season, this second of Israel's kings, King David. The anointed one of Israel, King David, already points to the Messiah that is to come. See, David is Jesus' ancestor. David and Jesus come from the same tribe and city. David was anointed with oil. Jesus will be anointed with the Spirit at his baptism for his mission. Like David, Jesus will also be very underestimated, even in his final hours on the cross. But his ministry that began at age 30, just like David's kingship began at age 30, will change the course of the world and will change God's people forever. So just two questions remain that I can think of. One, what will you allow God to do through you? And two, are you all in?